200 years ago, the peppered moth population living in England was made up primarily of light gray insects with little black specks. These moths were able to camouflage themselves against the light-colored lichens and bark that characterize the trees in their habitats, and thereby avoid predation by birds. But as the Industrial Revolution took hold in England, the soot from new coal-burning factories killed much of the lichen and covered the trees between London and Manchester. Relatively quickly, the light-speckled coloring of the peppered moth was no longer an effective disguise, and birds easily picked off the conspicuous insects. But a small proportion of peppered moths were born with dark coloring. These moths now found themselves very well suited to their environment, and they flourished. Over the course of many generations, the dark-colored moths began to dominate the population, and their frequency increased almost 100% by 1895. These days, our standards for environmental protection have risen markedly, and the air between London and Manchester is much cleaner than it was 100 years ago. The lichens have recovered, and many of the trees are no longer covered in soot. And the dark-bodied moth is becoming less frequent, as its light-speckled counterparts find themselves once again camouflaged effectively in their native habitat. This example illustrates an important observation that scientists have made about life: the striking way in which organisms are suited to their environments, and the fact that there are many more examples of animals whose coloring enables them to blend into their habitats represents another key observation. Many organisms have similar characteristics. Yet there is a vast number of different moth and butterfly species, which leads to one more observation: life is richly diverse. These three observations, adaptation to the environment, similar characteristics across species, and the diversity of life, puzzled and amazed scientists for centuries, including Charles Darwin. By proposing a theory of evolution, he sought to explain the causes of these properties of life, and by doing so, ushered in a new era in biology. Today, evolution is biology's fundamental organizing principle. But what does evolution mean to biologists, and how does it help us understand how complex, highly organized collections of cells, such as human beings and other animals, are related to the single-celled organisms that we met in the last lecture? To define it, let's turn to Darwin's own words. Evolution is descent with modification. That is, today's species are modified descendants of ancestors that inhabited the world in days past. Now, we can talk about evolution in two different ways: as a pattern and as a process. The pattern of evolution is seen in data from a myriad of disciplines, from geology and physics to biology and chemistry. These disciplines provide us with the facts of evolution, observations of how the natural world has changed. The process of evolution refers to the mechanisms that cause these patterns, and if anything remains open to modification, it's the mechanisms by which evolution occurs that remain somewhat theoretical. Until the mid-1800s, most people believed that every animal on Earth was created as we see it today, that species do not change, and that the uniqueness and diversity of species on our planet was a testament to the power and creativity of God. Charles Darwin changed all of that. But like every scientist, his work built upon the observations and missteps of others. Science progresses because scientists constantly question and check the work of those who go before us. Darwin came from a relatively wealthy family. His mother's family made Wedgwood china, and his father was a doctor who made extra money on the side by lending it to his patients. He had a brother named Erasmus, and the two of them built a chemistry lab in their home when they were teenagers, preparing to be doctors themselves. But at Edinburgh University, where they both went to study medicine, Charles discovered that he hated the profession, and so he threw himself into the world of natural history instead. Charles wasn't the first scientist in his family, and though he never met him, his grandfather, also named Erasmus, seems to have influenced his work. Charles Darwin's grandfather was a colorful character, Erasmus Darwin went a bit wild when his wife died. He fathered children out of wedlock and promoted sexual freedom. Charles's father found Erasmus somewhat embarrassing and shielded his son from stories about his life and work. It wasn't until Charles went to Edinburgh to study zoology with a man by the name of Robert Grant, who was an admirer of his grandfather's, that he discovered the impact that Erasmus had made on the field. Erasmus Darwin first suggested that, I quote, "the strongest and most active animal should propagate the species, which should thence become improved," end quote. An eerie harbinger of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Perhaps it was also an explanation for some of the life choices that Erasmus himself made, choices that he might have argued would improve the human species by leaving behind more little Darwins. Around the time of Charles's grandfather's death, at the turn of the 19th century, Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monnet, Chevalier du Lamarck, put forth the blasphemous claim that the fixity of species is illusory. New species, he said, can form through spontaneous generation. Lamarck went on to suggest that each species has a nervous fluid that transformed it over generations into new forms, achieving greater complexity with subsequent generations. A remarkably modern idea well before the discovery of DNA. But if this were true, then we'd see evidence in the fossil record that older fossils would show ancient animals that were less complex than those of the modern day. At the time, the oldest fossils on record showed animals just as complex as those living at the time: woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and bizarre marine creatures. Back in 1798, when Napoleon's armies attacked Egypt, they discovered that Egyptians mummified their pets as well as their friends and family. And these mummified corpses of animals looked just like their contemporary counterparts. Ancient cats looked like current cats. These mummies and the initial findings from the fossil record were considered evidence against the idea of descent with modification and proof that species do not change over time, but simply become extinct as a result of some environmental catastrophe like a large-scale flood. Scientists at the time didn't realize just how old the Earth really is, and that woolly mammoths and Egyptian cats were still relatively recent creatures. Unfortunately, Lamarck is best known for his erroneous hypothesis that the behavior of an individual member of a species during its lifetime can be passed down to the next generation. For example, he suggested that giraffes were initially short-necked animals, and that they tried to eat leaves that were tall in the trees by stretching their necks. So the more they stretched their necks, the more of this nervous fluid flowed into their necks, and the necks grew longer. Then, when the giraffe reproduced, it passed along its longer neck to its offspring. We now know that these types of changes are not the ones that are passed down, and therefore they are not the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Robert Grant, a teacher and mentor of the young Charles Darwin, praised Lamarck's ideas, much to the detriment of his own scientific career and to the surprise of young Darwin. After working with Grant at Edinburgh, Darwin embarked on a 5-year journey aboard the HMS Beagle and forever changed our understanding of biology. But when he first set foot on the ship, evolution still seemed to him a far-fetched notion, supported by only a fringe group of radical thinkers. We often think of Darwin as a pioneering adventurer, sailing the world's seas for the love of science. But seasickness made him a terrible sailor and plagued him throughout his voyage. And as we'll learn later on, he even made some rookie mistakes when it came to collecting specimens. And his ideas ultimately weren't completely original. As we've seen, many of them have roots in the writings of the scientists who came before him. But what made his treatise on the origin of species so influential is the mountain of evidence that Darwin supplied to back up his thoughts. In science, a theory is judged by how well it accounts for all of the available evidence and whether or not it provides testable hypotheses that can be used to evaluate it. Darwin's theory did both. He found converging evidence from different scientific domains, such as geology, biology, and geography, but he also pointed out where data were still missing and where scientists should look to disprove his ideas. There remained many mysteries, such as the emergence of flowering plants, and many holes in the fossil record that could show how one species gave rise to another. Since Darwin's observations, many of these holes have been filled with new evidence, and as a testament to the veracity of his theory, his ideas have withstood the test of time and the emergence of new data intact. Let's consider the most famous example of adaptation in Darwin's work. These days, if you want to go on an educational vacation and your pet topic is evolution, the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America would undoubtedly be your destination of choice. I've never been, but I can assure you that it's on my bucket list. What's so special about this collection of tiny islands in the Pacific Ocean? Well, they are unquestionably beautiful, relatively uninhabited, romantically remote, and delightfully exotic. But most importantly, they represent the aha moment that led Darwin to formulate his masterpiece. Ironically, he didn't realize the significance of his observations on the islands until long after he had returned home. But what captured his imagination is the diversity and uniqueness of the plants and animals that he saw while in the Galapagos. While in the Galapagos, Darwin collected specimens of birds from the various islands and eventually sent them to John Gould, a British ornithologist. He had observed different beaks belonging to different birds and had assumed that they were all different species of finches, wrens, and blackbirds. But many years later, he went to hear Gould talk about the birds at a meeting of the Zoological Society, and he was astonished to hear that they were all, in fact, finches. They simply had different beak shapes so that they could eat different foods. Darwin realized that not only had he failed to notice this diversity within the same category of bird, he had also been careless in his note-taking and hadn't written down the island from which each bird had been collected, his rookie mistake. Frantically, he contacted Fitzroy, the captain of the HMS Beagle, and asked his crew to send along the specimens that they had collected to John Gould. And unlike Darwin, the crewmen proved to be much more meticulous. Many had noted the specific islands which housed each bird. From these notes, Darwin found out that the different types of finches lived on different islands, and he was puzzled by the diversity that characterized these relatively close and similar islands. It turns out that the abundance of particular types of food is one of the properties that distinguishes one island from another. And the finches that populate a particular island have beaks that are adapted specifically to the type of food that is most easily consumed in that environment, whether it be insects, seeds, buds, or cactus flowers. This realization gave Darwin heart palpitations and an upset stomach. If finches from the Galapagos descended from one ancestral species, and their diversity resulted from adaptations to specific environments, could the same process explain the evolution of man? A visit to the zoo to see an orangutan named Jenny inspired him to jot down in his notebook, "Man from monkeys?" after noting that her expressions were similar to those he observed in infants. But this observation was also deeply disturbing. Darwin found the idea that humans descended from monkeys frightening because of its implications for his religious beliefs. We'll get back to Darwin's story, but let's pause a bit to discover the significance of his discoveries. The Galapagos finches demonstrated the diversity of variations between closely related species, but Darwin observed another branch of evidence supporting the theory of evolution that came not from differences, but from similarities. Evolution, according to Darwin, is the descent with modification from an ancestral organism as its descendants face slightly different environmental conditions and adapt to them accordingly. Depending on the environmental conditions, and by environment, I'm including the other organisms that are present in a particular habitat, anatomical structures present in a common ancestor can be harnessed for different purposes by different species. We call these body parts homologous structures, and the similarity present in different species descending from the same ancestor is called homology. One example of a homologous structure is the mammalian forelimb. All mammals have the same 5 basic bones in their forelimbs, from bats to cats to humans and even whales. One large bone is connected to 2 smaller bones, connected to several even smaller bones. These are attached to metacarpals, the bones in the palm of your hand, which are in turn attached to phalanges, or your finger bones. But despite the similarity in this arrangement, each species uses forelimbs for different purposes, from manipulating tools, as we do, to running and stalking, as cats do, to swimming in whales and flying in bats. Another example of homology is found in development, when every vertebrate embryo starts with a tail and throat pouches, which turn into gills in fishes and ears and throats in humans. Some of these homologous structures continue to characterize a species even when they are no longer useful. When this happens, the features are called vestigial structures, vestiges of an animal's ancestor. Examples of vestigial structures are the eyes that are buried under scales in blind fish, or the pelvis and leg bones found in some species of snakes. But not all similar structures across species indicate descent from the same ancestor. Some body parts result from convergent rather than divergent evolution. Divergent evolution describes how the same ancestor can produce different species with different traits. Convergent evolution describes the independent evolution of analogous or similar structures in different species resulting from adaptations to similar environments. So in convergent evolution, similar traits come from different ancestors. A famous example of analogous structures is found in marsupial squirrels, mammals who develop in an external pouch rather than in the uterus. The sugar glider squirrels in Australia look very much like flying squirrels in North America, sharing similar adaptations that allow them to glide through the air over long distances. But in fact, they are much more closely related to kangaroos and other marsupials than to the squirrels or other North American mammals. So homologous and analogous structures are one type of evidence for the process of evolution. A second domain in which evidence is found is the fossil record. We look to the fossil record to find out what types of species roamed the Earth at different points in time. As I mentioned earlier, in Darwin's day, the fossils that paleontologists had discovered only went back so far in time, and the animals that left their mark were found to be large and quite distinct from those currently alive, but no less complex. So many scientists of the 19th century interpreted this evidence as showing that species might go extinct, but they don't evolve from each other as descent with modification suggests. Over time, however, as paleontology progressed and more fossils were uncovered, the data provided more support for evolution than for the idea that species are static. Today, there is a vast amount of evidence showing that past species not only differed from current species, but were progressively less complex the further back we go in time. And that certain early organisms gave rise to many different versions of more complex forms, with the biodiversity across the ages resembling a tree with more and more branches, rather than a series of lines ending in oblivion. In fact, modern genetic research allows us to trace our origins all the way back to the ancestors of the simplest one-celled organisms that still populate our planet. Critics of the theory of evolution sometimes point to holes in the fossil record as evidence that the theory has yet to be proved. Certainly, the fossil record is not a complete catalog of every organism that ever roamed the Earth. Fossils are best preserved in sedimentary rock layers, and not all animals had the foresight to die under the optimal conditions. Fossils then represent primarily species that were abundant in terms of numbers and widespread in terms of habitat. Species were also more likely to become fossils if they had hard shells or skeletons that could withstand decomposition. But despite these limitations, the fossil record is remarkably rich, and it's a great source of evidence supporting evolution. A third type of evidence for evolution comes from the geographical distribution of species, or biogeography. By understanding continental drift and the movement of land masses over time, we can predict where fossils of particular organisms should be found and how one species gave rise to the others. For example, around 250 million years ago, there was only one supercontinent on Earth called Pangaea. Over time, as different parts splintered off, new environments were created that forced species to adapt to different conditions if they were to survive. By charting the emergence of these adaptations and comparing them to the geological changes resulting from continental drift, we begin to understand why some species that currently live on different continents seem to share the same ancestor or not. Australian animals, for instance, are particularly different from animals on other continents, showing features such as the marsupial pouch, not found anywhere else. But at one point in time, marsupials were present on Pangaea. The earliest known marsupial seems to have lived in China, but over time, marsupials on continents other than Australia became extinct. And when Australia branched off from the southern continents, it became a marsupial raft of sorts. So Australia isn't the only place in the world where marsupials developed. It's just the only place where they survived. Darwin's work enabled us to understand that. Darwin's terror of his idea that man descended from monkeys prevented him from publishing his thesis for more than 20 years. A positive consequence of this delay was the thoroughness of his treatise and the amount of evidence that he produced to back up his ideas. But in 1858, a naturalist in the South Pacific named Alfred Russel Wallace sent him a manuscript outlining his own ideas about evolution. Darwin was devastated. Wallace had come up with virtually the same notion, albeit with less evidence. Ever the gentleman, Darwin convinced his colleagues to publish the two manuscripts simultaneously, giving credit where it was due. Darwin's main contribution is not the idea of descent with modification itself, but rather the mechanism by which evolution occurs, natural selection. He observed that there is individual variation in a species in terms of hereditary traits, and that species produce more individuals than their environments can support. As a result, many of these offspring fail to survive and/or reproduce, creating competition for survival among individuals in a population. From these observations, he inferred that those individuals whose inherited traits gave them a better chance of survival in their environment tended to leave more offspring than others, and that over time, this ability of certain individuals to survive and reproduce shifts the proportion of the desirable traits in a population, leading to the gradual accumulation of changes adapted to the environment. One of Darwin's key insights, that species produce more offspring than the environment can support, came from his readings of the economist Thomas Malthus, who suggested that human suffering was largely the result of overpopulation, whether it takes the form of famine or disease or war. Natural selection, then, is the process by which individuals with certain inherited traits produce more viable offspring, which leads to a better match between the species and its environment over time. Of course, if the environment changes due to some catastrophic event like a flood or global warming, natural selection may result in new adaptations or even the rise of new species. Or the species can go extinct. Darwin coined the term natural selection to distinguish it from artificial selection, which farmers and breeders had already been practicing for hundreds of years by the time he proposed his theory. Whereas farmers and animal breeders artificially chose animals with desired traits and bred them together to change the frequency of those traits within their population, natural selection does not work with such a determination in mind. Nowadays, the term artificial selection has been replaced by selective breeding. I want to underscore a subtle but important point about natural selection. It works on a population, not on an individual. That is, it's a population that evolves, not a single organism. I might be blessed with a hereditary trait that makes me more likely to survive in our modern world. For example, let's say that tall people tend to make more money, providing more support for their kids and ensuring that their kids survive. I might be really tall, so my kids will be tall too, so they might be more likely to reproduce. But it's only across generations that we can see the effects of natural selection, only when we compare the genetic makeup of my generation with that of my children's. Finally, natural selection can only work on heritable traits that differ among individuals. If all organisms in a species share the same trait, that trait cannot change, and therefore the species can't evolve. Let's take a moment now to observe natural selection in our own lives. Chances are that at some point in your life, you've gotten a bacterial infection and a doctor prescribed some antibiotics to treat it. And you were told to complete the course of antibiotics, take all the pills in the bottle, even if you felt better before you finished taking them. By now, you've probably heard why it's so important to finish the course of antibiotics, but let's examine the reason through the lens of natural selection. Let's imagine that you have a bacterial infection like strep throat. You notice a sore throat, fever, and other symptoms, and you immediately go to the doctor. She swabs your throat, sends a sample to the lab, and it comes back positive for the streptococcal bacteria. She then prescribes a 7-day course of amoxicillin, an antibiotic derivative of penicillin shown to be particularly effective in killing this particular pathogen. You take the drugs, and within a few days, you feel much better, with symptoms completely absent 4 days later. On the 6th day, you decide to go away for the weekend, and you forget your bottle of pills. Oh well, you think, I'm not sick anymore anyway. What's happening in your body? Very likely, the antibiotic has killed most, but not all of the streptococcal bacteria swimming around in your cells. Which bacteria have survived? Those that show some resistance to the drug and that were not exterminated before you stopped taking your pills. These individuals then survive to reproduce and create more offspring that are also resistant to amoxicillin. Now you've created a new population of bacteria that are harder to treat because of their inherited resistance. Now, strep throat is not generally fatal, but some other bacterial infections like methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, can be. Staphylococcus aureus is a common bacteria found in the skin, lungs, and the blood. Many people carry it unknowingly. As we mentioned in the last lecture, bacteria are small and can reproduce in a matter of minutes, allowing resistance to antibiotics to develop very quickly over a rapid succession of generations. Penicillin first became widely used in 1943, and by 1945, already more than 20% of staph strains in hospitals were resistant to the antibiotic. Since then, many different antibiotics have been used to treat infections, but the bacteria seem to be particularly efficient at developing a resistance. Now, MRSA strains have emerged that are resistant to virtually every one of the antibiotics in our arsenal. Hopefully, we'll come up with a new way to fight MRSA soon, but be sure to take that full dose of antibiotics that your doctor prescribes for you because evolution is happening all around you and inside you every day. Darwin's theory was controversial in his day because it left little or no role for God in the evolution of man. And although there is broad scientific consensus that his theory is largely correct, controversy continues in the non-scientific communities to this day. It remains a dangerous idea, one that many people find hard to stomach. But despite this controversy, our approach to medicine in the West takes full advantage of our knowledge of evolution as we develop drugs in genetically similar species, knowing that they have a better chance of working in our own bodies. And we learn about our bodies from rodents and non-human primates and other animals because we share such a long evolutionary history. We combat the invasive viruses and bacteria that are quickly adapting to the environment in our own bodies to ensure our ability to survive and reproduce. We've come a long way in understanding our world and the beings with which we share it. But Darwin's theory of natural selection isn't the only mechanism by which evolution occurs. In the next lecture, we'll explore some alternative ways by which species can change.